Welcome to Eastern State Penitentiary Historic Site. My name is Sean Kelly, and I'm the Senior Vice President, Director of Public Programming. Who's here for the first time? Well, welcome. We love seeing new faces in the building. Welcome. And for those old friends who are returning, welcome to Eastern State Penitentiary. On behalf of my boss, Sally Elk, who's in the back, I think I see Bethany Kalo, a couple of other board members might be here as well. So we welcome you, and we're so glad that you're here tonight. On a steamy night, I always think on nights like this or days like this about how this building's never air conditioned. And so the officers, and even more particular, the inmates, lived inside of small rooms with almost no ventilation in this building for 142 consecutive years. Never had air conditioning in this building. Not in this space. We're staying in the surveillance hub of this 178-year-old abandoned building. So from the middle of this room was designed to give you access and visual surveillance over the entirety of Eastern State Penitentiary Historic Site. Since the building was built for solitary confinement, it's also one of the only places we have where we can gather large groups. So welcome, thanks for putting up with the heat. This is our Searchlight Series. We do this every single month in and month out. Searchlight presentations are always on Tuesday nights. They're always free. They always start at 6 o'clock. We always have a reception following. We'll have one tonight in the hallway that you came in through, so we hope you stay for that. We have surveys on your chairs. Please fill those out. We really do read those. As a matter of fact, some people have mentioned in the past they wanted to hear more voices from law enforcement, which has led us to tonight's speaker, which is a delightful, wonderful thing we have the commissioner here. Next month, Searchlight is also going to be wonderful. In his new book, Escape to Prison, criminologist Michael Welch explores 10 prison museums on 6 continents, examining the complex interplay between culture and punishment. He writes, prison museums tend to invert the Disneyland experience, becoming the antithesis of the happiest place on earth. We invited him here because we want to hear what our colleagues are doing in other prison museums to address contemporary issues. It's a challenge for us. We've been working on it very hard for about 3 years now. As part of that, we've been asking ourselves, asking our visitors some very difficult questions about the past, the history of the American prison system, what's happening in American prisons today, and most importantly, the future of the criminal justice system in the United States. What kind of criminal justice system do we want for our children? These are the questions that our programming here increasingly asks these days. We believe in open dialogue here. We don't believe in debate. So we are not here to get in arguments. We're here to discuss ideas openly. So we are coming to listen to our Commissioner of Police and to engage in a true conversation about policy. We've written some very blunt questions. We have sent the gist of them to the Commissioner to give him a sense. We don't want to ambush him. We want to have an actual dialogue here. We only have about an hour, so I'm going to spend 45 minutes asking some questions that we brainstormed here with our staff. We'll open it up at the end for for questions from the audience, and then we'll make it an early night. So please join me in welcoming the head of the 5th largest police force in the United States, Philadelphia Police Commissioner Charles Ramsey. Thank you so much for being here. We really do appreciate your time. I'm going to jump right in. Your recent work heading the President's Policing Task Force gave you the opportunity to look at how policing operates throughout the United States. What do you think are the most important lessons that came out of this work, and how are they informing your leadership here in Philadelphia?
Well, first of all, it's really an honor to be here with you this afternoon, or this evening, I guess it's after 6 o'clock. The President's Task Force was really a great opportunity to listen and to get a perspective of what's happening in policing across the country. Obviously, there are a lot of issues, a lot of legitimate issues that are facing law enforcement right now. And we've got to work toward resolving those issues. We didn't have much time. When I got the call from the White House just before Thanksgiving of last year, asking if I would co-chair the task force, it wasn't until the 18th of December that the President named the remaining members of the task force. It was a diverse group, 3 members of law enforcement, 2 people that have the civil rights activists, 2 very young civil rights activists, one from St. Louis, one from New York City that were directly involved in the protests that were taking place there. We had academics and researchers as part of the group as well. So we had a very good mix, and we had a very brief time in which to complete our work. The White House will tell you it's 90 days, it was really 70, that we had to have a report on the president's desk. So we decided to focus on 6 key areas. One is building trust and legitimacy. The reality is that there are many of our communities, especially our more challenged communities, there's a great deal of tension between police and community for a variety of reasons. And we need to address that and address it head on and just deal with a lot of the very real issues that affect us. The second was policy and oversight. We have to take a look at policies. Many departments' policies have been in place for a long period of time, not necessarily a reflection of current thinking in policing, best practices as we call it. Oversight, which is a huge issue now, whether or not there should be civilian oversight of police. Training and education was another area that we focused on. Technology and social media, which has had a huge impact, not just on policing, but on society in general. Community policing and crime reduction, and then officer safety and wellness. Those were the 6 areas that we focused on, and we were part of 7 different listening sessions where over 120 people came in and testified. We had close to 100 submit written testimony. All this was done in a relatively short period of time, and in May of this year, the final report was published by the president. And there were a lot of lessons, an awful lot of lessons, and a lot of it really stems around building trust and legitimacy in communities, particularly communities of color. There's tension that exists. There has been actions on the part of police that have been just wrong, and it needs to stop. We have to find ways in which we can deal with the crime issue, a very real crime issue in many of our communities, and at the same time, be able to build that trust and have a dialogue, have communication. Not necessarily easy, but very doable. And so listening and really getting closer and building communication with the community is probably the most important thing that came out of the report.
Can you tell us a little bit about the civilian oversight conclusions that you drew and how you think those might affect oversight here in Philadelphia?
We unanimously agreed that there needs to be some form of civilian oversight. Now, it should be up to each community to decide what that looks like, and by community I mean city, to figure out how that should look. The mayor appointed a oversight committee here in Philadelphia. I met with them yesterday, as a matter of fact. They're overseeing implementation of our collaborative reform efforts. In 2013, I asked the Department of Justice to come in and take a look at our department and give some recommendations about improvement in training, policy, use of force, things of that nature. And they concluded their work in March of this year, and I was given 91 recommendations. That, coupled with the 37 that directly pertain to law enforcement out of the President's task force, we are actually in the process of implementing those recommendations. One is civilian oversight. Now, there are various models of civilian oversight, and when you talk to different people from different parts of the country, there are a lot of different models. Some work well, some don't work well.
What do you favor here in Philadelphia?
Well, we don't really know. It's got to be right for Philly. But I think they ought to have input on policy. I think they ought to be able to review training. I think they need to really play a very active role. One of the things that I have done when we've rewritten our directives, we have what we call a use of force review board that takes a look at shootings and other serious uses of force on part of police officers during the course of their duty. And we've added to that review board the head of the police advisory commission here in Philadelphia, which is a civilian oversight group, and we added them to that particular function. Now that's totally new and different. That had been totally internal. But the oversight role that Dean Epps from Temple Law is currently heading, some variation of that will probably be permanently put in place at some point in time.
Can you explain a little bit more about that? I was going to ask you about that anyway. So.
Well, what they've done is, for example, we gave them drafts of our directives around use of force, or 5 different directives we gave them access to. They made comments, and they made some pretty doggone good ones, some that, quite frankly, I probably would not have seen, recognized, or put in place had it not been for that third-party review from someone who's looking at it through a different perspective. And we incorporated that in there. Now, there were a couple that I didn't agree with, but the majority of them.
Sorry to interrupt. Yeah. Could you give us an example of one you didn't agree with?
Well, one that I didn't agree with had to do with the issuance of tasers. I believe that, and we have about 2,000 officers that have been issued these electronic controlled weapons. We have a week's worth of training on how to deal with issues with the mentally ill, people going through a mental health crisis. It's called CIT training, Crisis Intervention Team Training. It really focuses on de-escalation, identifying early on someone suffering, going through some mental health crisis, because historically there's been too many instances where police come on these situations, don't really know what they have, don't see it, wind up either shooting an individual or using some high level of force. And we need to be able to de-escalate situations and so forth. After they go through that week's training, then they're issued, given a one-day taser training, and they are issued a electronic control weapon, which is a less than lethal option that they would have if they have someone who they really cannot take into custody any other way. Better is required.
Mic check! Mic check! Mic check! Mic check! If you pull someone over, if you pull someone over for a traffic violation, just write the freaking ticket. Just write the freaking ticket. Per Charles Ramsey. Per Charles Ramsey.
Yeah, I agree.
Welcome back. Thank you for agreeing to continue the conversation. It's about 10 days after you and I spoke last, and we requested that we could just come here to your office and finish the conversation. So thank you again for your time.
It's good to have you here.
Thank you. When we were speaking last, we had talked about your role chairing the President's task force on policing in the 21st century, and I think we'd finished up that conversation, and we were talking about the Federal Office for Community-Oriented Policing Services, which made the 91 recommendations. This is the federal organization that you invited here to Philadelphia to make recommendations. And we were talking about their recommendation that the department combine the two boards that have oversight on investigating when there's a police-involved shooting. The recommendation was that they combine those two boards. And they said the department does not fully accommodate the Police Advisory Commission. And I wonder if you would comment on that, please.
Well, first of all, the group that came in as part of the Department of Justice is the COPS Office, Community-Oriented Policing Services. It is part of the U.S. Department of Justice. They have something called collaborative reform. We're the third agency to be part of that. The first was the Las Vegas Metropolitan Police. And I happened to read that report, and that's what really made me contact them and ask them if they'd come in and do a review of this department. There are more than 90 recommendations that are part of that report. We're in a process now of implementing recommendations. The one that you're referring to about two different boards, one being our Use of Force Review Board and our Police Board of Inquiry. The Use of Force Review Board is a group that comes together to review all shooting incidents to find whether or not they fell within policy, if there's some additional training needed, perhaps discipline needed, or what have you. The Police Board of Inquiry is a formal disciplinary mechanism that we have internally. If a person is found to be in violation of policy within the Department of Procedure, they're entitled to a hearing, and that is the Police Board of Inquiry. The recommendation was that the two be combined. That cannot be done by contract, union contract, unless it's negotiated. We have negotiated and have in practice had the Police Board of Inquiry for certainly way beyond my time here, as well as the Use of Force Review Board. That's one of the things that we did make mention to when they were going through that process of reviewing, that it's not just something you can just do. It's something that you have to actually negotiate with the union, if that is to be.
And how is that different than the Police Advisory Commission?
Well, the PAC, the Police Advisory Committee, was begun under a mayor's executive order prior to my arrival. In fact, the current mayor, Mayor Nutter, is the one that actually sponsored that legislation. Now, what they do is investigate some complaints coming from citizens alleging police misconduct. They are funded separately. They aren't funded by us. They are not part of the police department. They are totally separate, totally independent. So their funding would come from city council, right, as part of the regular budget process. It does not come from the police department, but they do have access to files. They do have access to information. We are looking at ways in which we can get the head of the pack more involved. For example, with the Use of Force Review Board, I recently, in a directive that we just changed, included them as part of that Use of Force Review Board, so that he hears these cases, he has access to all that information, and he would be part of the process, more so certainly than they are now. We also have posted all of our shootings, summaries of shootings online for the general public. One of the few agencies in the country that actually do that, and our reviews go back to 2007 actually, where we put summaries of what took place and also the status of the investigation. Is the DA still reviewing it? Has it come back? Has it passed through the Use of Force Review Board? Whatever the process may be.
Is the head of the Police Advisory Commission a civilian?
Yes, he is a civilian.
Civilians, or is it? I guess the question I'm getting at is the civilian, the transparency to a civilian body.
They are all civilians, and they are independent of the police department.
I wanted to ask you about stop and frisk policies.
Yes, sure.
And the reason is because at our Searchlight Series at Eastern State, we have had several critics of those policies speak, and I wanted to give you a chance to, I know you're a supporter of those policies, I want to give you a chance to respond to them. In particular, the ACLU filed a report this past year, just here in the 2015 year, citing numbers from 2014, saying there was 200,000 police stops in 2014, and that the report says 37% were without reasonable suspicion. And I think that's 550 per day of number of pedestrian stops, which to someone who doesn't do this every day sounds like a lot. And so I wanted to give you a chance to respond to those concerns.
Well, first of all, when we talk about stop and frisk, we refer to it internally as Terry stops. Terry versus Ohio, a Supreme Court decision from the 1960s that allowed officers with reasonable suspicion to stop an individual and to pat them down for weapons to make sure that they're safe and they don't wind up getting injured. They can seize that weapon, certainly if they find a person in possession of a weapon. That's a Terry stop. Over the years, it has been kind of become something where people have used different terminology, stop and frisk. The frisk is not necessarily something that has to occur every time you stop an individual. You do need to have reasonable suspicion and pat them down. Stop, question, and frisk would really be the three steps, but one doesn't automatically have to follow the other. Unfortunately, we have a lot of violence in Philadelphia. We have a lot of gun violence in Philadelphia, people carrying illegal guns. More than 700 people already this year shot. I have 180 murders that have been committed, 85% with the use of a firearm. So we have a real problem here. The question is, are we stopping people with the reasonable suspicion that's required by the Supreme Court? Officers are required to make out a form called a 48A when they make a stop. That gives the information as to who you stopped, where you stopped them, but more importantly, the reason why you stopped. And that's where you have to articulate the reasonable suspicion. Now, we have entered into an agreement with the ACLU. They have access, they can review. We have internal process in place to be able to review these things to make sure that officers are properly articulating the reasons for the stop. Unfortunately, we have some officers that aren't very good writers, and they do not do a very good job of articulating why they stopped an individual. And we've been working through training and education to make sure that they know how to write a report that would have the reasonable suspicion that you need based on the circumstances. And I'm not talking about a boilerplate type of thing. Each scenario is different. Each set of circumstances is different. But understanding what really constitutes reasonable suspicion so that you can justify the reason why you stopped an individual. And so it needs to continue, in my opinion. I am a proponent if it's done properly. And I don't think you can have a situation where you don't use it at all. To totally take it away, I think is ridiculous. That's just the way I feel about it. I don't think it makes any sense, but it should be done within the constitutional guidelines, no question about that. But you have to deal with the reality of what's going on out there on the street. And you see it every single day, and you watch the news reports, and you see it occurring. And we had 700 people shot. I can think of 700 people that probably wished we had seen that person beforehand and stopped them and actually got the gun before they had a chance to get shot. So we need to do things in a proper way. We need to be able to properly articulate. But people want to make this into an issue that's very simple and say, well, no, police shouldn't be stopping anybody, and they certainly should not frisk them. I don't agree with that at all.
I'm going to just follow up a little bit there, that if there were 200,000 of these stops last year and 37% of them didn't list the reason for the probable cause, that's 74,000 cases where there was no probable cause listed in the paperwork. And you're confident that those are all just a question of the paperwork, that the better trained officer, but you're confident that in those cases there was reasonable suspicion, it's just that it's a question of paperwork?
Well, no, that's not what I'm saying. I'm saying in the majority of those cases, I do believe it's a question of paperwork, but there could be some stops that are improper. And we have to take the appropriate action against that officer if someone is misusing their authority by stopping people without reasonable suspicion for just either harassing or doing whatever. I mean, just stopping for the sake of stopping without what they need to make the stop legal. So I'm not saying, and I can't say out of 200,000 there's absolutely no instances at all where we've had that, but we need to root that out. But you don't throw the baby out with the bathwater, because 37%, maybe that's a pretty high figure, but that means over 60% were cases where the officers did have reasonable suspicion. So I think we need to continue to work to make sure that all of our paperwork is done properly, that they can withstand the audits, and that officers aren't abusing their authority. And if they are abusing their authority, then we'll take very swift, decisive action against those officers. But the way to deal with the problem is not by saying you cannot under any circumstance stop and pat anybody down for weapons at all. It ignores the reality of the streets of the city that are just absolutely incredibly overrun with illegal guns. And so we need to find a solution, but it's not an easy solution just saying, well, then get rid of it. I don't agree with that at all.
Well, thank you. I have one more follow-up question, actually two. There were some people with Mural Arts who were at the presentation at Eastern State last week. Mural Arts has a program called the Youth Violence Reduction Partnership, which they call the Guild. They do wonderful work helping people as they leave prison to transition back into the community. And they're friends of ours and colleagues of ours. They brought a group of their members and who had planned to ask you these questions, but of course they weren't able, but they did send the questions forward to me, and they get at a follow-up question about the stop and frisk. This is Zamir Payne, who wanted to ask, why do beat cops not let me walk by them without stopping me and intimidating me? And then another member of the Guild, Calvin Brinkley, wanted to ask, when is stop and frisk going to end? I feel is racially biased. And the only reason I bring this up is because, of course, critics of the program say that it diminishes the sense of trust between the officers and the community. I want to give you a chance to respond.
Well, first of all, if he's just being stopped for no reason, there is no reasonable suspicion, then he shouldn't be stopped, period. There is no justification for an improper stop. Officers need to have reasonable suspicion, as I've said before. If not, then they should not be stopping a person simply because of where they're located, what they look like, or things like that. I mean, you have to have more than that in order to make a stop. When will it end? Under my administration, it will not. It will be done properly, but it will not end. Constitutional stops will continue. And I don't know what's going to happen when you get a new mayor who may have a different philosophy. Things could change. But for the remainder of 2015, it's not going to end, but it will be done properly within constitutional guidelines.
What about the perception? I understand what you're saying
right.
about the reality. I take your point, but perception that it's racially biased?
Well, I mean, there is a perception it's racially biased, but the reality is that we have a disproportionate number of minorities that are victims of crime in this city as well as offenders in this city. That's, again, reality. And I'm an African-American male, and I'm not proud to say something like that, but that is reality. 85% of my homicide victims to date are either Hispanic or African-American. 85%. That's double the population of this city. I mean, when is that going to end? The rate of offending, very similar numbers. So if we want to talk about bias, we want to talk about the disproportionality of some of this stuff, then let's look at the reality of what's going on out there. It doesn't mean that majority of young African Americans are committing crime, because they're not. They're not. But this isn't as easy as people would like it to be, where you can look at a census tract and say, okay, this is the percentages that you have, therefore your stops, and therefore this, that, and the other ought to be the same. Crime is not equal. And our response to it has to be based on what's really happening out there on the street. But there's no excuse for an officer not to do their job properly. There's no excuse for an officer not to make stops within constitutional guidelines. But it is what it is, and you can't really ignore that. That's like movements about, police misconduct and so forth. It's legitimate. We have some officers that are bad officers, and we need to root them out. And certainly during my tenure here, I've not been shy about getting rid of people that have conducted themselves improperly. But that doesn't mean the majority of the force is that way, because it's not. So I expect people to perform fair and impartial policing, and you let the cards fall where they may. But you can't do it just based on percentages and ignore some realities that we're faced with here in the city of Philadelphia and other cities.
You mentioned that there'll be a new mayor soon. Mm-hmm. Almost certainly will be Jim Kenney. And he says he trusts you and wants to keep you as police commissioner if you'll stay. He also says he doesn't like the stop and frisk policy. So I'm wondering if you see conflict on the horizon over the policy with whoever your new boss might be.
Well, I think that, first of all, you have to have a real understanding of what we do and why we do it. And I'm opposed to stop and frisk without reasonable suspicion if it's done outside of constitutional guidelines. I'm opposed to it. So we don't disagree on that at all. I don't know if when people say things like that, if they mean just there should be zero stops made in the city of people. So if you get a flash message of a robbery just occurred, a person is a male wearing, blue trousers, a blue shirt, black rimmed glasses, about 6'1", Caucasian, mixed gray hair, walking down the street, and there you are, a block from the scene, and you perfectly match the description. That we should not stop and just find out who you are. And because it's an armed robbery, point a gun, that for my own protection, I should at least be able to make sure that you're not armed, because I don't want to get shot. So if that's what you're saying, then, that's an issue. But, the mayor's the boss, and they set the direction. So I've not had a complete conversation around that sort of thing. But that's going to be whether I'm the police commissioner or anyone else is the police commissioner. You have to get on the same page with your boss, and the mayor is the boss.
Just hypothetically, what if he insisted that you stop the policy? Is that something that you would you?
I've been in policing since 1968. I've been around a long time. And I've served in 3 cities. I love this profession, I really do. But I think it's important that a mayor and their police chief be on the same page and be in sync. And if they're not in sync, then it's up to the commissioner not to be the commissioner any longer. Because the mayor's the boss, and they call the shots. And so that's just the way it is. But,
Okay. Thank you. I'm going to change the subject here a little bit. Given the cases of Mike Brown in Ferguson and Eric Garner in Staten Island, Walter Scott in Charleston, South Carolina, 2015 saw a growing sense among some Americans, not everyone of course, but some Americans, that police use deadly force indiscriminately when confronting people of color. And I wonder if you would tell us, if you could speak to the roots of that perception. I know it's something that obviously is front of mind for every police officer in America, so if you would tell us your thoughts about that perception and where we're going.
Well, police should only use deadly force when absolutely it's a last resort. There's nothing more important than the sanctity of life. We do live in a society where, unfortunately, there's a great deal of violence, and some of that violence is directed toward police as well. March 5th of 2015, I had one of my police officers, an African-American officer by the name of Robert Wilson, shot and killed when 2 armed robbers entered a store that he happened to be in, and he's in full uniform, and they opened fire without warning and shot and killed him. So there's a lot of violence that takes place out there. Anytime an officer inappropriately uses force, then it ought to be dealt with, and dealt with very, very quickly. But I also think that we have to deal with the reality of what's going on. Not every time an officer fires a gun, it's wrong. And so I don't have all the facts and details around many of these cases, but I do think that there are some where the use of force was totally unjustified. And that being the case, then the officers ought to face the consequences in terms of criminal prosecution. There are cases where one can debate whether or not an officer could have used other tactics or could have done whatever, but the use of force in and of itself was justified. You have to look at each of these individually. And I think that there is a perception out there. There's no question about that. And perhaps there's some basis to that perception. But we have to get beyond just the accusatory stage that we're in right now, where everything is just, in my opinion, looked at through a lens where, well, the police were wrong. We have to be able to have dialogue. We have to talk about these things. We've got to improve our training, got to improve our policies. We've got to do all these things. But then we also have to deal with the reality of crime that's occurring in these neighborhoods and why sometimes people are a little hypervigilant and quick to react, simply because of the amount of violence occurring around them. Everybody wants to go home at night. So we've got to be able to find that balance. We got to be able to sit down and have that dialogue. I know we're working very aggressively to do everything we can here to go reality-based training, forcing officers to make judgment in terms of any use of force, de-escalation techniques, to be able to take a situation that's very volatile and be able to de-escalate it. The other thing that I think, to keep things in context, I mean, you know, we take a lot of guns off the street. You know, more than 1,000 guns taken off the street so far this year without a shot being fired by the officer who took the gun off an individual who was armed. We don't talk about that. So most of those contacts when guns are taken from individuals don't result in a shooting. Why? Because the officer used sound tactics. They were able to get that gun. They chase people down that actually have taken shots at them. And they've been able to chase them down and take them into custody without firing a shot. So any use of force that's inappropriate is unacceptable. One is too many. But I think the problem with what I'm seeing now is there's no context at all.
What do you think is, what's changed? I mean,
What's changed is social media. What's changed is the general media as a whole that just get on one thing and just show it over and over and over again and give people the perception that that's what's going on around the country and every cop is engaging in this. There are 800,000 police officers roughly in the United States, about 18,000 police forces, federal, state, local. 800,000. If 800,000 people were out of control, do you think you might notice it? I do. It's just not what's going on out there. Doesn't mean that we don't have officers that make mistakes. Doesn't mean that we have officers that some of them do their job totally inappropriately and take action for wrong reasons, but that's not the majority. And so there needs to be balance and context when we talk about there are legitimate issues. The problem I have with what occurred the other night, for an example, at Eastern State University, with people that they interrupt. Okay, that's fine. You interrupt. So we wait a minute, we wait 2 minutes, whatever. At some point in time, you need to be able to get back to dialogue. Because if all you want to do is yell and scream, you're not going to solve anything, and you're missing an opportunity. It's a crisis in a sense, but with crisis comes opportunity for real change. This movement that's going on around the country potentially could be the most significant civil rights movement since the 1960s if people would sit down and talk and figure out solutions to problems, as opposed to just yelling and screaming without any action being taken. People want to look back in the 1960s. Many of those people that are part of this weren't born in the 1960s. I happen to have been born in the 1960s. So along with all the protests, behind the scenes was negotiation, was discussion, was real movement toward change. And so those things have to, in other words, at some point you got to go beyond just the yelling and screaming and accusing folks of everybody being racist, everybody being this, everybody being that, using very inflammatory language like what was used in Minneapolis not too long ago, where an officer was killed and they referred to him as a pig in a blanket and fry him like bacon. I mean, that's just that. I mean, where are you going with that kind of rhetoric? Absolutely nowhere. And at some time, it's going to require thoughtful people to sit down and have thoughtful discussion. And when I participated and co-chaired the President's Task Force on 21st Century Policing, that's what we got. And I think we wrote a very significant report with very concrete recommendations and concrete actions. And we talked to people. Two of the members of our task force are activists. They were out on the street at Ferguson, out in the street in New York City. Young people, thoughtful people that want to change but willing to sit down and talk. That's what we need.
Well, we're all about sitting down and talking, so I agree with you. This is much more productive than other approaches. So and thank you for taking the time to talk. And I take your point about the 800,000 officers. But of course, officers are expected to be held at a higher standard than the general public. So I guess I want to get back to what has changed. You mentioned social media. I think there are people who, I think some of the critics in the audience on Tuesday might have said that social media is exposing something that, at least that's the sense that we've heard from other of our audience members, that social media is exposing something that has been hidden to date. And how would you respond to that?
Well, what I would say is that social media has exposed some things that aren't right. There's no question about that. But it's also been a mechanism used to spread things that aren't true. I mean, it's a double-edged sword here. And I think, again, we need to get at the truth. We need to get at what actually took place and let a process take place that really people have faith in and believe can really uncover the truth, whatever it is. But, I mean, it cuts both ways. I'm not opposed to social media. I'm not opposed to cameras. I mean, which in the process of putting cameras in place right now in the city, I think it's a good thing. Body cameras. But I think that we also have to take time to really, think about what we're doing, not be so quick to judge on either side, because we're being accused of stereotyping. Well, people are stereotyping us. And what I would disagree with one thing you said, and that is that, we are held to a higher standard, and we should be. But that doesn't mean that the public should be held to a low standard. People need to have and take responsibility for what's going on in their communities, too. So this sticking your head in the sand and saying that, the police are the reason why we have all these problems and this, that, and the other. The average homicide that we deal with here in the city of Philadelphia is African American against African American. That's reality. And a lot of people don't want to hear, oh, no, you can't say that. Oh, no. Well, why not? It's reality. So we got to deal with both. Because the reason cops are even in a neighborhood is because of the crime taking place there. Get rid of the crime, why would we even be there? Why would we be making stops? Why would we be doing all this stuff if there weren't for crime? So what I'm saying is that we all have a lot of work to do. In the most challenged neighborhoods, there are more decent, law-abiding people living there than criminals. No question about it. That's why cops have to get to know the community and get to know who's who. Because the criminal element's actually embedded within the larger population. We need to be able to surgically remove those folks without disrupting the community at large. That's where we have had some issues, is that we don't often do that as well as we should be able to do it.
How could it be done better?
Knowing the people, continuity of assignment, community policing, getting out there, really knowing the people, knowing the difference between a basketball team leaving practice, standing on the corner, and a bunch of gangbangers standing on the corner waiting to do something they got no business doing. You see, that comes from knowing the players, knowing people. Working toward and supporting prevention, and we do an awful lot. And we've got a diversion program now in our schools that has resulted in a dramatic reduction in the number of kids that have been arrested for various things in schools. And we do that with the courts, and we do that with our prosecutors, and of course with the schools. Because the goal isn't to give a kid a record, the goal is to change the behavior that's eventually going to take them down a path that's going to lead to an arrest, it's going to lead to a record, it's going to lead to something very, very negative. And we've been engaged in that sort of thing. But that's the stuff that we really need, is to prevent it from occurring, but we can't do, it's not just police, it's communities got to do it, which means they've also got to work toward improving conditions in the neighborhood as well.
I'm going to change the subject a little bit to the Safety and Justice Challenge that in May, Philadelphia was awarded a 6-month Safety and Justice Challenge from the MacArthur Foundation. And the department is one of 5 partners, I believe. And this could result in $2 million a year for up to 5 years to come up with a plan to lower the number of people in Philadelphia jails. There are currently 8,000 people in a given day in Philadelphia jails. Can you tell us about that, what your plans are to get that money and what you would hope would come out of that aside from lowering the number of people?
Well, we were given $150,000 for planning to come up with a plan. And a lot of it centers around diversion programs and options to arrest and incarceration. One of the things that you hear all the time, we got to reduce the jail population. I don't disagree with that. In fact, I believe that the only people that need to be in jail are those that really are harmful to the community at large. There needs to be consequences for illegal behavior, but not all of it needs to necessarily result in jail time. But you've got to have a safety net. You've got to have enough programs to be able to channel people into where you can have an alternative to incarceration and at the same time work toward changing behavior so that people are able to assimilate better into society. They're able to get jobs and hold jobs. If they're lacking the education for certain positions, having the ability to be able to go back to school and gain that so that they can be employable. I mean, all those kinds of things have to be a part of it. So a part of the goal certainly is reducing the jail population, but then again, what do you do with them once they're out? And that's really the key, is to have enough things in place to be able to handle and then have people coming out on the other end in a situation where they're not going to do the kinds of things that get them put in jail or arrested to begin with.
What do you think the police department's role is in that?
Well, we come in contact with folks before anybody else, so being able to identify quickly and be able to channel people into the proper, working with the prosecutors and working with courts, much like we're doing in schools.
You mentioned the options to arrest. What did you mean by that?
Well, other than just physical arrest, perhaps sometimes it's citations. I mean, we're doing that now. In fact, it was Mr. Kinney that sponsored the bill that 30 grams or less of marijuana now is no longer an offense that we take people into custody, summary offense. I wasn't real happy with that when I first heard it, but actually it's working, and I think it's a good alternative. But, things like that have to go even further because there are health consequences and so forth that perhaps people need to have some kind of counseling, treatment, and things of that nature, but that's kind of a different issue. But these are people that normally would have been arrested that aren't being arrested now. So that's some of it. Other is diversion programs, like I mentioned before, where people are put into different programs that change behavior. The court is right there. If people don't attend, if people don't finish, you look at driving under the influence. They have something called ARD, which is a program for a period of time that people go through about the dangers of drinking and driving and so forth. If they successfully complete that, they can get their driver's license back. So there are a variety. Right, it's an alternative to incarceration. So these are the kinds of things that if people successfully complete, even if they were arrested, perhaps they can get their record expunged, so it doesn't hurt them down the line getting a job, for an example. So I'm in favor of that. Anything we can do to keep people out of jail, I think is in society's best interest.
We certainly agree with that at Eastern State. We're always looking for alternatives to incarceration if they can keep their community safe. It's a general question. The crime rate in Philadelphia has dropped steadily since you became commissioner in 2008. It is up this year, and it's risen by 5%, I believe.
3%.
3%. To what do you attribute the rise, and how will you respond?
It's a slight bump. This is a part of the year where we could either finish even, we could finish up, or we could finish down, quite frankly. My homicides, for an example, is 3% over last year. That's 6 more people murdered this year versus last year. My shootings are up slightly from last year. Sexual assaults up slightly. Most of the categories are down. You have some fluctuations. Now, you have to also, again, in keeping with this whole idea of keeping things in context, last year we had a record year in a lot of different ways in terms of the amount of crime we had in this city. When we look at crime scenes, low. We're comparing ourselves to those numbers. So we're right within the same margin for the same thing that we had last year. Very, very close. Now, some cities have seen dramatic increases. Milwaukee, I believe, is 70-some-odd% up in homicides. DC's up 42%. Chicago's up 30% or so. We're actually up 3%. I mean, so we're pretty much holding our own as a city right now. I am concerned about the trend that I'm seeing around the country. New York City's up slightly. I mean, many, many major cities are up. And I think there's no time to panic, but I do think we need to look at it very carefully. What's driving it? What is it that's taking place? Why is it that we're not continuing to either hold steady or drive crime down? And of course, a lot of people have a lot of theories. Are police is aggressive because of some of the controversy that's taking place? Is it, repeat offenders? I mean, is it just like the stock market? Sometimes it goes up or down and there's no real reason why. I mean, I think it's too early to really tell. But we do a lot of analysis in this department. We monitor and track our crime very, very closely. And you can have 1 or 2 people that are reintroduced into the community or begin a burglary spree or robbery spree or whatever, and it'll spike your numbers. Same with theft from auto and things like that. So we really do track it very closely to see whether or not there's a pattern, whether or not there's an individual responsible, group of individuals responsible, or what have you. But one is too many. But to be in the fall or near fall of the year, and with 180 homicides in a city where we've touched 500 at one time. I mean, we are bringing it down, but again, for those 180 families, it's not enough.
What do you think about those theories about the crime rate? I've read a lot of debate whether it's even actually happening, whether nationwide, whether the murder rate really is rising nationwide, but there certainly are some cities like Milwaukee that as you mentioned, or a little bit in New York, a little bit here, where murder rates have been going up. But again, I've read some analysis of that, questioning whether that's even true nationwide. But if it is, we've certainly have read about some theories that it's because police are feeling insecure and becoming less aggressive, I guess is the word that's used. What do you think about that? Well, how would you comment about that?
I think it's too soon to really tell. I think everybody's got theories, and they have no problem at putting them out there in some manner, shape, or form. But I don't know. I don't know. I mean, you could say that officers are a little reluctant to get engaged because of all the criticism and so forth. I've not really seen that here. Now, does that mean that there aren't some that are a little less inclined to maybe be proactive when it comes to, stopping individuals or what have you? Yeah, it probably is, but I can't say it definitively because I don't know. I mean, who's done the real hardcore research to really get at it? Or are we just guessing and throwing a bunch of theories out? And we can't afford to do that. I mean, we need to know if there's something going on, and we need to really have proof and evidence that it is. I've not surveyed our officers to know one way or the other. It's just guessing. And I don't think others have either, to be quite honest with you. So it's too soon to tell. And I think that as more people begin to really take a look at this, to really do the kind of work that needs to be done in order to come up with a real reason, evidence-based theories, then I think that it's just going to be a lot of people writing a lot of articles and not necessarily based on on much of anything, but it's something to be concerned about whenever you have a rise in crime. I mean, that's what it's all about, is preventing crime. So I am concerned.
How would you characterize the morale of your department?
Well, I mean, I don't see any indication that it's particularly low or anything like that. I mean, I'm always concerned about it, but it's one of those elusive things that is very hard to really judge. I've been a cop a long time, and 3 different cities, and I have never, ever walked into a roll call room and everybody's laughing and joking, and you say, you know, what's going on? Oh, God, my morale is just so high, I just can't stand it. I mean, cops just tend to complain about a lot of stuff, but some of it's legitimate. And I think that one of the things, in fact, Pillar 6 of the President's Task Force report is devoted to officer safety and wellness. Now, a lot of people would think that we're talking about bulletproof vests and things like that, and that certainly is part of it, and we talk about seat belts and that sort of thing. But the mental health of police officers. Post-traumatic stress disorder is not limited to soldiers coming back from Iraq and Afghanistan. When you do this job and you do it for 10 years, 20 years, 30 years, and you see some of the stuff you see, which just is not normal, it's traumatic. And that's why in policing there's a high rate of divorce, there's a high rate of alcoholism, there's a high rate of suicide. I mean, all these kinds of things. And so the mental health and mental well-being of our police officers, we have to pay very close attention to. I've been here 7.5 years. I've had 8 police officers killed in the line of duty. 8. 5 shot to death. 3 in auto crashes responding to felonies. 5 of those we lost in a 9-month span. We had to reach out to University of Pennsylvania Behavioral Health to kind of help with counseling for police officers. And I went through it, and I had my whole command staff go through it as well, because we had to remove the stigma of that, because there still is a stigma associated with any kind of mental health crisis counseling. And we've got to get rid of that and be able to give people the help they need when they need it, because we want to make sure that officers then, you know, don't take that and then on the street you wonder why people are short, why they're not friendly, you know, and we really do need to think about the mental health and well-being of our officers, and that's why pillar number 6 was included in that report, and it's one of the most important ones in the entire report, in my opinion.
That's the end of the questions I'd planned to ask you when we met last week. We were going to take questions from the audience, and I think it's fair to say there were people in the audience who were concerned about a specific case. I want to give you a chance to respond to it. That's the case of Brandon Tate Brown. I had not planned to ask you about this last week. To be honest, it wasn't really high on our list. Of course, all of our questions, for the most part, that we developed for you come out of questions of around incarceration in prisons. That's what we do. We're a prison museum. But clearly there's some concern about this case, and so the protesters last week were concerned about it. I wonder if you would comment if you're satisfied that your officers handled that case properly, and if you just have it. I know there's been some concern in the community, so I want to give you a chance to respond.
Well, there is a civil suit that's been filed, so I'm limited in what I can say. But it did go through the process here internally and was judged to be within policy. The DA reviewed it, which as they review all of our cases, and it was found to be nothing of a criminal nature in the incident at all. And the officers were cleared as a result. And beyond that, because of the lawsuit, it's probably not wise for me to say much more than that.
You're comfortable that it was handled. Do you have a sense of why it has become controversial?
Well, I think the climate we're in right now is that just about every shooting becomes controversial. I mean, it is what it is, but that's why we have courts. That's why we have people that can objectively review these things on either a criminal basis or civil. And you let the cards fall where they may. And it is what it is. But I'm comfortable that the officers acted within reason in that particular instance.
His mother's asked why the officer didn't use a taser. Do you want to respond to that?
Well, listen, these things go down in a matter of seconds. We have months and years to review them. okay? And so, you know, I don't know if it's good for me to get into details as to why officers have judgment. The issue is whether or not the use of force was appropriate at the time. And that really should be the concern. Now, I do have to say this, that we did go way beyond what we would normally do in terms of providing information to the family. Mrs. Dickerson sat in this very room and saw the videotape for herself. We would let her review statements. We have witnesses in this case that saw what happened. We brought in some activists that from the community that came in, showed them what we had, gave them the opportunity to review it as well. That's not what we normally do, but we did it with transparency in mind, and so people would have the facts they needed and not jump to conclusions.
The family, I know, is hoping that that video be released to the general public. Can you tell us why?
Part of a lawsuit now. And we did release to her attorney. All that's been turned over.
I have one final question for you, and it's a very broad question just about the world we live in and the future of our country. The United States incarcerates a higher percentage of its population than any nation on earth, and that prison population is largely people of color, young men coming out of poverty. I'm sure we would agree that's not the country that we want to live in. Can you tell us what you think the policing could do to turn that around for the next generation, have fewer people in prison, especially fewer people of color, people coming out of poverty in prison?
It's not a policing problem. It's a larger social problem. I mean, we're the tip of the spear in a lot of things here, but you want to get rid of high incarceration rates, then do something about poverty, do something about education. And education to me is the key. There aren't too many people with master's degrees standing on the corner selling crack. The reality is we have an underground economy that supports many of our communities, and that centers around drugs and other types of illegal activity, because people have no other option. They have to be able to eat and be able to try to maintain themselves and whatever families they may have. You want to fix the problem, then get at the root of the social problem. And it's not the police. We get called in when everything else breaks down.
Okay, is there anything that we didn't talk about that you wanted to say?
No, I'm good.
Okay. I appreciate your patience coming down and sitting down with me a second time.
No, I wanted to, because what I was hoping for was good dialogue and discussion. I actually enjoy that. And we missed an opportunity, and that's the shame of that. It is a missed opportunity. And at some point in time, I would hope that after a defined period of time, you know, I want to do my thing and whatever, that's fine. But at some point in time, the goal has to be to have dialogue, to really sit down in thoughtful discussion to get changes that need to be made. That has to happen. Otherwise, it's a flash in the pan and nothing's going to change, and we're going to be at this for God knows how long. This is an opportunity for significant change, but it's going to require a lot of work on the part of a lot of people, and it's going to require listening, which is not always an easy thing to do.
Thank you for your time. I just in closing, we actually pay our speakers on this speaker series, which I know better than even offer, but we do have a check for $100, which is our speaker's fee for the Police Athletic League. And so I'll leave that with your staff on the way.
Young kids in Philadelphia will appreciate that, because every little bit helps, and we have 17 PAL centers around the country, around the city, that provide activities and support for youngsters, including after-school activities. It's not just sports-based, it's education-based as well. So I want to thank you and your organization for making a contribution to the Police Athletic League. It's really appreciated. Thank you.
Good luck. We wish you and your officers safety and good hard work this coming year.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, sir.